Hello, I'm an Onion, and today I'm going to explain to you how to play Magic the Gathering. So this is an episode of An Onion Explains How to Play Magic the Gathering, Part 1. Alright, here we go. So what is Magic the Gathering? Magic the Gathering is a collectible card game where players assume the role of powerful dimension-hopping wizards called Planeswalkers. Players take turns building up and maintaining resources to cast powerful spells with the intent of winning the game. Let's go over the basics. So any given deck has a minimum card requirement. In a constructed deck, the minimum number of cards is 60. So if you have 59 cards when attempting to play a constructed deck, it is not legal and you cannot play it. However, if your constructed deck has 200 cards, it is legal because it meets the 60 card requirement. The maximum copies of any one specific card is 4. So, for example, you cannot have 5 copies of a card named Onion Man unless otherwise specified. Players begin the game with 20 life points. The game ends when a player's life total reaches 0, or when a player draws a card when their library is empty. Players begin the game with up to 7 cards in their hand. 1 card is subtracted for each time the hand is redrawn, up to 7 times. So technically, a player can start the game with 0 cards in their hand if they redraw 7 times. I'll go over that in the next video. Before we continue, I'm going to briefly go over the different zones in the play area so you have a better idea of what I'm talking about throughout the rest of the video. Okay, so there are actually 6 zones. On your screen, you see 4 of them because the 2 zones that are not depicted here are, um, I guess they're invisible, right? Okay, so anyway, first zone is the library, and this is where your cards are drawn from, and cards are drawn from the top of your library. Next is the battlefield. Cards that enter the battlefield become permanents. Cards such as artifacts, creatures, enchantments, and land cards become permanents when they enter the battlefield. Next, we have the graveyard. This is the discard pile. Cards entering the graveyard enter it facing up. Creatures that die on the battlefield automatically enter the graveyard. The exile zone is similar to graveyard, but only certain effects or certain spells and certain abilities can put cards into exile. Cards don't automatically go into exile like they do with the graveyard. So cards that are exiled enter this pile facing up unless otherwise specified. And then we go on to the 2 invisible zones. Your hand. This represents the wizard's mind, and cards that are drawn but not played are kept here. This is pretty much your arsenal, or your active arsenal. Cards in hand are not revealed to other players unless specified by a spell or ability. And then the final zone, the stack. The stack is the zone where spells enter when they are cast and where abilities go when they are activated. More on the stack later on in the video. Now that we've briefly gone over the zones, we're going to continue on to resources. This is how you make use of things in Magic, starting with mana, cards, spells, permanents, and life. The first resource that we are going to cover is mana. What is mana? Mana is the magical resource used to pay for the casting cost of spells. Lands are the main source of mana production, and there are basic lands and non-basic lands. You can have as many copies of a basic land in the deck. For non-basic lands, you can have a maximum of 4. You produce mana from a land by tapping it. Tapping means you turn it 90 degrees. Players can play 1 land during their turn. Unused mana is lost at the end of the phase. There are 5 colors of mana. There's actually a 6th color, but it's kind of gimmicky. So we're going to go over the colors of mana next. The 5 colors of mana are white, produced by plains, blue, produced by islands, black, produced by swamps, red, produced by mountains, green, produced by forests. Other than the 5 colors of mana, or the 5 mana colors, we have colorless mana. There's an actual colorless mana, which is produced by the land type Waste. Out of all the sets in Magic, there's only one set that actually has the colorless mana type as a specific mana type required to cast spells. So you don't really have to worry about this so much unless you're playing cards from that set. The more common type of colorless mana is generic mana. It's depicted by a gray circle and a number inside of it. The number inside represents the amount of mana required to pay for the mana cost. Any type of mana can be used to pay this generic mana. So, for example, on your screen you see the number 1. So you can use any sort of color to pay that 1 mana requirement. So you can use a blue mana source, a white mana source, red mana source, whatever. And if, for example, you have a card that has a mana cost of 5 generic mana, you can use 5 mana of any color combination to pay for it, if that makes sense. The next type of resource that we are going to go over is the actual card. Right? So this refers to the inert state of spells or permanents when not on the battlefield or stack. A card is a card when it is in a player's hand, graveyard, or in exile. And there are 7 card types. This artifact, creature, enchantment, land, planeswalker, instant, and sorcery. So before we continue on to the other resources, I'm going to briefly go over the anatomy of a card so you can understand what I mean when I talk about the mana cost or the name, or when I say that you can only have 4 copies of the card. All right, so to begin, the name of the card. This is the card's name. So when I mentioned earlier that you can have only 4 copies of a specific card, that refers to 4 copies of a specific card name. So, for example, you can have only 4 copies of Agonizing Siphon in your deck, per the 4-card rule. Next, the mana cost. This is the mana requirement to cast a card or spell. You cannot cast a card until the mana cost is paid, or the spell requirement is paid. Not all cards have a mana cost. Most do, but not all. Next, the type line. This tells you what kind of card it is. Remember, I mentioned that there are 7 types of cards. In this example, this is a sorcery. Next, the text box. This shows the effects and abilities of the card, if there are any, and the effects are literal. So this card says it deals 3 damage to any target, and you gain 3 life. It does exactly as it reads. So you don't have to ponder what 3 life means, or ponder what the meaning of life is. It's literal. All right. Also note that there are two parts of a text box. The italicized text is called the flavor text and has no effect on gameplay. It's just, something for the lore. Not all cards have flavor text. Some do, some do not. This card does. The expansion symbol. This just shows which set this specific print of this card is from. Um, what I mean by that is there are many cards that are reprinted um, in different sets. So I don't even know what set this card comes from, but let's pretend that this card is in 5 different sets, right? Even though it's in 5 different sets, it still has the same name. As long as it has the same name, you can only have 4 of that card. So if you have 4 Agonizing Siphon from set 1 and 4 Agonizing Siphon from set 2, you can have only 4 total of Agonizing Siphon. All right, so now we're going to continue on to the third type of resource, spells. So spells are not exactly the same as cards. Um, all spells are cards, but not all cards are spells, if that makes sense. For example, lands are not spells. Um, I'll explain in a little bit. So a card is a spell when it is cast and goes on the stack. A spell can resolve or fizzle after going on the stack. When the card fizzles, it goes into the graveyard unless otherwise specified. Just take note, fizzle is an unofficial term. That just refers to when a spell does not resolve. All right? So when a spell resolves, its effects play out. That just means it resolves. So for example, in the previous example, or the previous card you saw, Agonizing Siphon, when it resolves, you deal 3 damage to the target and you gain 3 life. So its effects happen only when it resolves. Spells can be countered, exiled, or returned to the caster's hand. I have bounce in parentheses there because the unofficial term for return is bounce. So when you return a card, you bounce it. That makes sense. All cards except for lands or spells, because you can't cast lands and they just enter the battlefield. Spells typically have a casting cost or condition to cast. And as of December 2020, there are no land cards that are also spells at the same time. So when can you play spells? Instants can be played at any time when a player has priority, unless otherwise specified. Under normal circumstances, artifacts, creatures, enchantments, planeswalkers, and sorceries can be played only during the caster's main phase. Take note that I did not mention or include lands here because lands are not spells. So I'm going to continue by going over the different type of spells, starting with sorceries. We've already gone over Agonizing Siphon in the anatomy of a card, but here we're going to go over it in the context of it being a sorcery. So sorceries can be cast only during the caster's main phase. A sorcery immediately enters the graveyard after it resolves. Sorceries are not permanents. Sorceries do not enter the battlefield. Before we continue, I'm going to go over what the stack means. The stack. The stack is a game zone where spells and abilities are placed in order of their cast or activation until they resolve or fizzle. The most recently activated ability or cast spell goes on top of the stack. And this means the most recent spell or ability resolves first. Mana producing abilities do not go on the stack. Otherwise, it will be pretty OP, pretty oppressive too. When a card resolves, its effects are played out. When a card fails to resolve, when it gets countered or has no legal targets, it automatically enters the discard pile, aka the graveyard, unless otherwise specified. The informal term for when a spell fails to resolve is fizzle. A card fizzles when it fails to resolve. Remember, this is an informal term. The next type of spell is the instant. Instants can be cast at any time when a player has priority. This includes another player's turn, which makes instants very, very powerful. Instants immediately enter the graveyard after they resolve. Instants are not permanents, and instants do not enter the battlefield. All right, so now that we've gone over the non-permanent spells, I'm going to briefly go over what permanents are. Permanents are cards that enter the battlefield, and permanents enter the battlefield facing up, unless otherwise specified. Permanents stay on the battlefield unless they are destroyed, returned, exiled, or phased out. So, when can you cast permanent spells? Well, like sorceries, you can cast permanents only during your main phase. And permanents enter the battlefield when the spell resolves. Permanents may or may not have an activated ability. Right? If you see on your screen here, I've circled the text box for this permanent where it has an activated ability. The activated ability for this card or this artifact is pay 3 mana, tap, and draw a card. So some permanents have activated abilities, not all of them do. Permanents immediately enter the graveyard when they are destroyed. Alright, so far you guys have seen two different types of permanents. The artifact on this current slide and the enchantments on the previous slide. They're pretty straightforward, so there isn't much to say about them. But the next two permanents are quite different. I'll show you what I mean. So to start off, we're going to show you the creature permanent type. Right away, you'll see that there's something different about it compared to artifacts and enchantments. Before we go over the differences, I'm going to go over the similarities. So like the other permanents, creatures can be cast only during the caster's main phase, under normal circumstances. Creatures enter the battlefield when the spell resolves. And here's the first difference. Creatures immediately enter the graveyard upon death or when destroyed. So with the artifacts and enchantments, they can be destroyed and enter the graveyard upon destruction, but artifacts and enchantments don't die, at least not under normal circumstances. Creatures, on the other hand, can die. I'll explain what I mean in a little bit. Creatures can attack players or planeswalkers directly when they are declared as attackers. However, creatures have summoning signals and cannot attack or activate abilities on the same turn they enter the battlefield. Creatures can block attacking creatures during the declare blockers step. Alright, so finally we're going to go over the most glaring difference between artifacts, enchantments, and creatures. So creatures have what you'll notice on the bottom right, power and toughness. So this power and toughness appears only if the card is a creature, or if a permanent becomes a creature. The power refers to the potential damage of a creature, and the toughness indicates how much damage is required to kill the creature. The creature dies and enters the graveyard when it either reaches 0 toughness or when it receives damage equal to or exceeding their toughness. So for this example with the Serra Angel, its toughness is 4. If it receives 4 or more damage, it dies and goes to the graveyard. If its toughness becomes 0 or a negative number for whatever reason, it dies and goes to the graveyard. Alright, so finally we have the Planeswalker permanent type, and this is as different to creatures and the other permanents as creatures are to artifacts and enchantments. So let's go over the similarities again. First, the card name. All right, that's pretty basic, pretty self-explanatory. We've already gone over that. 2, the mana cost. We've gone over that as well. 3, okay, so this is the same, right? It has a type line just like any other card. However, all planeswalkers are legendary. What this means is there can only be one specific card or planeswalker card of that name on a player's side of the battlefield. So, for example, with this card, Jace, Ingenious Mind Mage, you can have only one copy of it on your battlefield. You can have 4 copies of it in your deck, but on a battlefield, there can only be one copy of it on your side. Your opponent can have another copy of it on his side, but neither of you can have 2 copies of it on the battlefield at the same time. So you can have a Jace Ingenious Mind Mage on your side at the same time as your opponent has Jace Ingenious Mind Mage on his side, but neither of you can have 2 Jace Ingenious Mind Mage on your side. Does that make sense? So this legendary rule applies to all permanent types. So if a creature is a legendary, there can only be one of that specific card name on your side of the battlefield. Same goes for artifacts and enchantments. There are also legendary sorceries and instants, um, but those are a little bit different. I'll go over those in a different video altogether. But anyway, getting distracted. So 4 is where it really starts to diverge from the other spells. So you'll notice right away that there's a number, um, a weird number on this card. Actually, 3 sets of weird numbers on this card. So what those are loyalty abilities. So the first loyalty ability on this card, um, highlighted in the rectangle, is draw a card. And you notice that it has a +1. So what this means is um, when you activate this ability, you draw a card and also add a Planeswalker loyalty counter to this Planeswalker. And then the same goes for the second ability, the +1 untap all creatures you control. When you activate that, you add 1 loyalty counter and untap all creatures you control. Right? So the next one is the one in the rectangle denoted by the number 5. -9, gain control of up to 3 target creatures. So this is different from the other 2 abilities on this card because it requires you to have at least 9 loyalty counters on the card itself before it can be activated. So if it doesn't have 9 loyalty counters, you cannot activate it. Once you do activate it, it takes away 9 counters and the ability triggers. Right? Do note that for Planeswalkers, under normal circumstances, can only activate one ability per Planeswalker per turn, unless otherwise specified. So for example, for this Planeswalker card, Jace, Ingenious Mind Mage, you can only activate the first ability, the second ability, or the third ability, but only one of them on each of your turns. However, if you have two different Planeswalkers, you can activate one ability on each of them, but no more than one ability. All right. So the last thing on the Planeswalker card is the loyalty counter. So the loyalty counter indicates the amount of loyalty counters the Planeswalker enters the battlefield with. So for this card, Jace Ingenious Mind Mage enters with 5 loyalty counters. Planeswalkers automatically enter the graveyard when their loyalty counter reaches 0. That's pretty self-explanatory. Alright, so we're at the last part of the video. And this is the last resource that we're going to cover, life. Players begin the game with 20 life points. And life is basically the player's score. The game ends under normal circumstances when a player's life reaches 0. Life points can be gained or lost throughout the game. Receiving damage from spells, abilities, or creatures will decrease your life points. Spells and abilities can increase your life points. There is no limit to how much life you can have, and you can technically reach infinite life points using some pretty crafty combos. I should mention that when your life increases, that's considered life gain, and when your life decreases for any reason, that's considered life loss. Alright, thank you so much for watching my video. So next time, in part 2 of this episode, I'm going to actually teach you how to play a game of Magic the Gathering. Now that I've explained the different parts or different components of Magic, I'll also go over the phases and steps of a game. So tune in next time. Bye.